So why did Lenin write this pamphlet? Well, the reason is, of course, it was in 1916 in the middle of the most horrific war in the history of humanity up to that point. The so-called socialist parties that were part of the Second International had capitulated to nationalism. The French party supported its state against the German state, and the German party supported its state against the French, et cetera, et cetera. So instead of workers of the world unite, the sarcastic motto was workers of the world cut each other's throats. This is a horrible setback for the socialist movement, turning from internationalism to nationalism. So in order to understand why this happened and what was behind the war, Lenin felt he had to analyze imperialism as it existed in that period. Only the Bolshevik Party and one other party took a firm stand against the war. So in order to reorient the socialist movement, Lenin had to explain the war. As Phil Gasper put it in one of the articles for today, Lenin's main goal in imperialism was to show how the colonial expansion and imperialist rivalry in the late 19th and 20th century were rooted in profound changes in the nature of capitalism during the same period. That's why he called imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century a stage of capitalism. In Russian, his pamphlet was actually not imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, but it was imperialism, the latest stage of capitalism. Lenin did not claim that there was no imperialism before the late 19th century. As he explicitly noted, colonial policy and imperialism existed before the latest stage of capitalism and even before capitalism. What Lenin was attempting to explain was the extremely virulent form of imperialism that began to emerge in the late 19th century, resulting in the scramble for Africa from the 1880s and increasing tensions between the major powers that eventually led to World War. In calling it a stage of capitalism, Lenin was saying that the new imperialism was fundamentally an economic phenomenon. A key difference between that stage of imperialism and previous phases was the export of capital and the exploitation of labor, which became dominant. It was no longer just a competition for markets and raw materials. The key points that Lenin used to define that stage of imperialism were the following. Number one, the concentration of production and capital developed to such a high stage that it created monopolies which play a decisive role in the economic life. The merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation on this basis of finance capital and a financial oligarchy. Three, the export of capital, which has become extremely important as distinguished from the export of commodities. Four, the formation of international capitalist monopolies which share the world among themselves. The territorial division of the whole world among the greatest capitalist powers is complete, was the fifth element. In short, his definition, he said, if I had to define it in one sentence, I would say imperialism is capitalism in its monopoly stage. Lenin, Bukharin, and Trotsky pointed out other contradictions. The contradiction of international production and the political form of the nation states. So production was growing across borders, but the political form of capitalism was still the isolated nation state. Nation states were produced by capitalism when it was rising. It became the political form of competition between blocks of capital. So the capitalists would not jettison the nation state. In fact, they needed it for competition. As Marx noted, capitalists are a, quote, band of hostile brothers. That is, they're united against the working class, but fiercely competitive against each other. Bukharin, who Lenin based his pamphlet on, argued that as a consequence of two contradictory processes, internationalization of production and the growing together of corporations and the state, economic competition between capitals increasingly tends to take on the form of geopolitical competition. In other words, economic competition comes to be expressed in terms of political and military rivalries between states for territory, influence, and power. The political conclusion that Lenin drew from this is that only an international working class revolution could end the threat of war. Imperialism, he said, was not just a policy choice. It was not just something they decided to do, but it was an inherent stage of capitalism itself. Now, there have been alternative analysis of international competition that have taken place before and in the current period. To go back to the period that Lenin was writing, Karl Kautsky, a leader of the German Social Democratic Party, created the theory of what he called ultra-imperialism. This meant that internationalization of production undercut the drive for war between the great powers. Instead, the great states would unite to exploit the colonies. He said that only that wing of capital that produced armaments and so forth, that is the military-industrial complex, as we now call it, was what wanted war. That capitalism in general was not tending towards war. He said, therefore, the solution was diplomacy, further advances of capitalism, and creation of organizations like the League of Nations, which was the predecessor of the United Nations. His policy, that is Kautsky's policy during World War I, was not one of sharp opposition to the war, but instead calling on the states to negotiate with each other. In recent years, there have been other theories that try to undercut Lenin's or oppose Lenin's theory. In the 1990s, Hart and Negri put forward the idea that the world had changed from imperialist rivalry into imperialist domination by diffuse multinational institutions. That is, the old division was gone, and instead they called the whole organization of the world empire, but not imperialism. A similar analysis was put forward by Robinson in a book called Into the Tempest, where he said there was a newly developing multinational ruling class. Nation states, he said, were being replaced by the developing international state. The anti-globalization movement of 1999 against the WTO and onward after that adopted versions of this kind of approach. They said that corporations and not states were the key factors in the world today. And as a result of that, the anti-globalization movement was unprepared for the conflict that broke out between the US and Iraq shortly after the WTO protest in 1999. Another theory was put forward by Gindin and Panish, who said that the US was the only superpower and has dominated the Western world, and therefore the old inter-imperialist rivalries were no longer there. So what a lot of these theorists put forward was that imperialism had been replaced by what they called globalization. That is international production all over the world, multinational corporations, etc. This led to reformism. If war was no longer inherent in capitalism, as Lenin said, then they felt it could be reformed away, again, like Kautsky, by treaties, etc. The rejection of imperialism as a system, as a whole system, also gave an impetus to campism, the idea that people on the left should support opponents of the US, that is, support Russia against the US, etc. The logic was that if the US was the only imperialist power, then to be anti-imperialist, one had to be anti-US and therefore support the US's enemies. That is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, was the logic that produced campism. Let's look at the evidence as to which of these theories apply. From 1991 on, there was the collapse of the USSR and Eastern Europe. The US tried to press its advantage under Clinton, Bush, and Obama to become the only major imperialist power. From 1991 to 2008, there was what analysts called the unipolar moment. That is, the US was the only real superpower. This idea, this analysis, was the basis of globalization replacing imperialism. It led to ideologies that downplayed state competition. The expansion of the WTO to include China was based on the idea that the US was so confident in its dominant position that it felt it could incorporate China into its international order and not see it as a rival. Of course, even then, there were still tensions with Russia and China, and even inside the Western Bloc, and wars continued. There was the Iraq War of 91 and 2003, the Kosovo War of 1999, the Afghanistan War of 2001 for 20 years. After 9/11, the US attempted to reassert its US dominance in a big way. The US, against promises it made to Russia, expanded NATO, and it used NATO in Kosovo and in Afghanistan. However, it was the rise of China economically and militarily, and Russia militarily. This resulted in Obama producing what he called the pivot to Asia, that is, pulling away from the Middle East and putting more military resources to compete with China. So by 2008 to 2009, with the Great Recession, the unipolar moment had yielded to the decline of the US after its defeat in the Middle East and the rise of China. China did better in 2008 and 2009 during the Great Recession than the US did. This resulted in the rise of China and the reemergence of Russia and other countries. So the result of this was what Ashley Smith, former member of the ISO, calls asymmetric multipolarity. In other words, the US was still dominant. It was still had the strongest military force and really the strongest economically, but we had returned to a multipolar world. It was no longer just the US dominating. So despite the spread of global production, corporations still needed the states to back them up. States also rely on the economic power of corporations. So the connection of states and corporations was still very strong. The analysis that rejected Lenin's theory ignored a couple of the key facts about capitalism. Capitalism is a system of competitive accumulation. That is, cartels, treaties, agreements are truces in a war of all capitalist classes against all other capitalist classes. Competition yields changes in the balance of economic and military power over time. The domination of one state yields to the rise of other states. Capitalism is never static. As Marx put it, under capitalism, all that is solid melts into air. So the situation today is that there's global investment under US domination, but it is more and more giving way to renewed what is called blockification, or the formation of economic trade blocs, etc. There is the China, Russia, Iran bloc versus the US, NATO, and the EU. Other states are jockeying and being pulled between the blocs, and there's also regional imperialist competition, Iran versus Saudi Arabia, etc. There are intensified attempts at economic domination with the US versus China and Africa, EU and NATO and the US versus Russia and Ukraine, etc. US competition with China in terms of investment in Latin America. And there are, of course, flashpoints of war. Besides Ukraine, we have the South China Sea, where a war could break out as well. So let's go back and look at Lenin's key points and see if they still apply today. The first point he mentioned was a monopoly domination. This is certainly true of the economies of the world. The growth of financial, second one was the growth of financial capital. Absolutely. A large part of the profit that comes to capitalists today flows from the financial sector. 3, the export of capital. Yes, this is still a really big feature of the world economy. 4, the formation of international capitalist companies, which share themselves. That is definitely true if we look at Boeing and Airbus, etc. The 5th one, the territorial division of the world among the greatest capitalist powers is complete. However, even in Lenin's time, this was not fully complete. South America, for example, was mostly independent countries. There were independent countries in Asia, etc. Today, formal colonies of the great powers are much less prominent, but there are still battles for domination, trade blocs, etc. Many commentators stress the superficial differences between Lenin's theory and the specifics of our own time to reject his revolutionary political conclusions. Instead, we should maintain his revolutionary political conclusions that flow from a very similar analysis of what he said back during World War I. War is still inherent in capitalism. Imperialism is not a choice or policy. There are specific imperialist policies, but imperialism itself, overall, is a necessary stage of capitalism. The military is still needed to back up economic competition. As President Woodrow Wilson, who was president during World War I, put it, since trade ignores national boundaries and the manufacturer insists on having the world as a market, the flag of his nation must follow him, and the doors of the nations which are closed against him must be battered down. Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers of state, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outraged in the process. Colonies must be obtained or planted in order that no useful corner of the world may be overlooked or left unused. Socialists need to be resolute anti-imperialists. We need to oppose the imperialist system which maintains capitalism. This means, first of all, opposing our own imperialist power, but all others as well. We cannot accept any justification for any actions by imperialist powers. There are no excuses. There are no, quote, legitimate security concerns, as supporters of Putin put it, in saying that they have the right to somehow take over Ukraine. Imperialism still is not a policy choice, it is a stage. The capitalist state must defend capitalist interests no matter which party is in power. Both parties have defended imperialism and do. The most left Democrats in the US today that are promoted by people in DSA, for example, are still pro-imperialist. Even the Labour Party in Britain defends British imperialism. We need to, here in the US, oppose both capitalist parties, both of which are imperialist. Lenin's slogan at the time was to turn the imperialist war into a civil war. For Lenin, this is an immediate prospect. He wrote this pamphlet in 1916, and by 1917, the Bolsheviks had led the working class to take power in Russia. For us, this is a bit of a longer-term perspective, but still, we need to still use anti-war and anti-imperialist movements to build revolutionary organization and build towards an international working class revolution. Only international proletarian revolution can end the threat of war and annihilation. Rosa Luxemburg's idea that we face either socialism or barbarism can be updated to say we face either socialism or extinction. Thank you.